Picture a country of roughly 10 million people, about the same population as the US state of Michigan, packed into a land area roughly the size of Alabama. It has no aircraft carriers, no blue water navy that could contest the open ocean against the United States, China, or even the United Kingdom. On a military map, it barely registers as a footnote. This is not a story about a government. It is not the product of a single state decision. No one designed it this way. No president has ever ordered a blockade in its name. And yet, by the end of this briefing, you will understand why that country still belongs at the center of any serious conversation about who really controls the ocean. Here is what that actually means. At almost any moment of any day, somewhere between a sixth and a fifth of the entire planet's ocean-going cargo capacity, the crude oil keeping refineries running in Rotterdam, the liquefied gas keeping the lights on in Tokyo, the wheat feeding cities in North Africa, the iron ore feeding steel mills in eastern China, is sitting inside a ship that this country's citizens own. Not flagged to this country, not sailing under its flag, not, most of the time, even crewed by its people, just quietly, invisibly, owned by it. No navy enforces this arrangement. No treaty guarantees it. No international body assigned it. It simply happened, ship by ship, deal by deal, family by family, across most of a century, until one country most people couldn't locate on a map ended up owning more cargo carrying capacity by tonnage than any other nation on Earth, including the largest oil tanker fleet on the planet. Think about what that actually means in practice. At any given time, some of the largest oil tankers ever built, vessels rivaling the Eiffel Tower in length, are crossing the world's oceans, and decisions made privately, in office buildings outside Athens, determine which refinery each one sails toward next. Those decisions are rarely debated in a parliament, rarely announced at a press conference, and rarely covered by name in the news you read. They are simply commercial calls that, added together, move the price of energy for hundreds of millions of people who will never know they were made at all. Here is the question this briefing is built to answer. How does a country this size acquire this much invisible power over global trade? And what would actually happen to the world economy the day it decided, even partially, to use it? By the end, you'll see why the real fragility in this story isn't a strait, a canal, or a choke point you could find on a map. It's something far harder to see and far harder to defend against. But to understand why this matters, you first need to see exactly where it sits on the map. The country is Greece. And before the postcard image forms in your head, whitewashed villages, blue domes, ferries drifting between islands, set it aside, because the geography that built Greek shipping has almost nothing to do with tourism and everything to do with necessity. Greece is not a single landmass. It is a fractured archipelago of somewhere between 1,000 and 6,000 islands and islets, depending on how small a rock has to be before it stops counting. Official counts of the inhabited ones range from under 200 to just over 200, since Greece's last full island-by-island census took place in 2011. All of them are scattered across the Aegean and Ionian seas. Its mainland is dominated by mountain ranges that made overland travel slow and expensive for most of its history, cutting communities off from one another by rock rather than connecting them by road. For thousands of years, if you wanted to move people, olive oil, grain, or timber from one Greek community to the next, the fastest and often the only practical route ran across water, not across land. This is not folklore, it is basic terrain. Greeks did not choose the sea as a speciality, the way a country might choose to specialize in wine or software. Geography left them very little alternative. That forced relationship with the sea never went away. It modernized instead. Merchant seafaring under the Greek flag and Greek captains persisted through the Byzantine centuries, through Ottoman rule, when Greek ship owners, operating semi-independently within the empire, built substantial trading fleets across the eastern Mediterranean and the Black Sea, and into the era of steam and then diesel-powered cargo ships in the 20th century. But the true expansion came after the Second World War, in a very specific and almost accidental way. The United States had built more than 2,700 low-cost, mass-produced Liberty ships during the war to move troops and supplies across the Atlantic. When the war ended, Washington needed to get rid of a surplus fleet it no longer needed at anything close to its original cost. Greek ship owners and captains, many of whom had already spent generations trading across the Mediterranean, bought these ships in bulk at steep discounts and turned them into the founding capital of what would become the modern Greek shipping industry. Names like Aristotle Onassis, Stavros Niarchos, the Livanos family, and the Latsis family became shorthand for a particular kind of post-war fortune, built not on oil fields or factories, but on owning the vessels that moved everyone else's oil and everyone else's cargo. Their heirs, along with hundreds of other family-run shipping houses that followed the same basic playbook: buy cheap during a downturn, hold through the recovery, reinvest the profits into more tonnage, still run the majority of this industry. Walk down a single street in the port of Piraeus, just outside Athens, Acti Miauli, and you are standing in the control room of a meaningful share of the planet's seaborne trade. Shipping offices line this street for blocks. Some trace their history back 3 or 4 generations. Others were built from almost nothing within a single working lifetime. Here is where the story gets genuinely strange, and where the word "quietly" in this episode's title earns its place. If you tried to verify Greek dominance of world shipping simply by looking at ship registries, the flags flown from the stern of each vessel, you would largely fail to find it. The overwhelming majority of Greek-owned ships do not fly the Greek flag at all. According to United Nations trade data, the world's 3 largest ship registries by tonnage are Liberia, Panama, and the Marshall Islands, together accounting for close to half of the entire planet's ocean-going cargo capacity. None of those 3 countries builds ships, insures them at meaningful scale, or has any operational relationship with the vessels beyond collecting registration fees. They are what the industry calls open registries, or flags of convenience, low-cost, low-friction jurisdictions that accept foreign-owned vessels with minimal nationality requirements. A supertanker financed and controlled from an office on Acti Miauli might legally be, on paper, a Panamanian or Marshall Islands vessel. The beneficial owner, the person who actually profits, decides, and bears the commercial risk, is Greek. The flag painted on the hull tells you almost nothing about who is really in charge. This is the first layer of invisibility that defines this entire system. Ownership and flag are 2 entirely separate legal concepts, and the gap between them is precisely where a huge share of global economic power quietly hides in plain sight. Now the numbers, drawn from the 2 organizations that track this most closely. The United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD, calculates beneficial ownership by deadweight tonnage, the standard measure of how much cargo, fuel, and stores a vessel can carry. And its most recent count places Greek-owned companies at roughly 16% of the world's entire merchant fleet, ahead of China at just over 14%, and Japan at just under 10%, with Singapore in fourth place. That already makes Greece the single largest ship-owning nation on Earth by this measure alone. The Union of Greek Shipowners, the industry's own trade association, calculates the figure differently and reports a substantially higher share, closer to 1/5 of the entire global fleet, once smaller vessels and additional categories are included. Whichever methodology you trust, the conclusion is the same. No other nation on the planet controls a comparable share of the physical means of moving goods across the ocean. Within that fleet, Greek owners hold the largest oil tanker fleet in the world by capacity, roughly a quarter to nearly a third of all tanker tonnage globally, depending on the category. They also operate one of the largest liquefied natural gas carrier fleets on Earth and rank at or near the top in dry bulk carriers, the unglamorous workhorses that haul the iron ore, coal, and grain that heavy industry and food supply chains depend on every single day. Put together, the Greek-controlled fleet runs to roughly 5,800 vessels, with a combined carrying capacity exceeding 450 million deadweight tons, larger, by that measure, than the entire beneficially owned fleet of China, the world's second-ranked ship-owning nation. One detail matters more than any of the raw tonnage figures. More than 98% of the capacity of the Greek-owned fleet operates in what the industry calls cross-trade, carrying cargo between two countries, neither of which is Greece. A Greek-owned tanker might load crude oil on the Arabian Peninsula and discharge it at a refinery in South Korea, having never once approached a Greek port on that voyage, or any voyage that year. Greek shipping, in other words, is not primarily a service to Greece. It is a business built almost entirely on being everywhere else, present in the economic life of dozens of countries, yet invisible to nearly all of them, showing up only as an entry in a ship's registration paperwork that almost nobody outside the industry ever reads. Greece's shipping community also has deep roots outside Greece itself. Greek merchant families have maintained a major presence in London for well over a century, drawn by the marine insurance markets, shipbroking houses, and commodity exchanges that concentrate financial control of global trade in the City of London. That relationship shaped the industry, rather than being replaced by Piraeus's post-war boom, which is part of why a Greek-owned vessel today so often carries British or Scandinavian insurance and classification, even when every other part of the transaction runs through Greece. That is the geography, the history, and the ownership structure. It explains where this power sits and who holds it. What it does not yet explain is how fragile that system actually is, and what happens to it when the world stops behaving normally. And that geography hides a fragility almost nobody talks about, until it breaks. To understand the fragility, you first need to understand how a Greek-owned ship actually functions on a day-to-day, transaction-by-transaction basis, because almost nothing about it works the way most people assume. Layer 1. The asset. Greek ship owners are, at their core, buyers and sellers of enormous floating steel assets, each costing anywhere from tens of millions to well over $100 million. Very few of them build the cargo they carry. Very few of them trade the oil, the grain, or the containers moving inside their vessels. What they do, with striking consistency across 3 or 4 generations, is buy ships when prices are low and hold, or sell, when freight rates and asset values rise. Shipping is one of the most brutally cyclical industries on Earth, swinging between gluts and shortages roughly every few years as new vessel orders flood the market and then get absorbed by growing trade volumes. Greek owners have built a reputation, going back to those Liberty ship purchases in the late 1940s, for buying counter-cyclically, acquiring tonnage during downturns when banks are nervous and competitors are retreating, then holding it through the recovery that inevitably follows. Shipping industry accounts have described the same pattern repeating after the 2008 financial crisis, when freight rates and second-hand ship values collapsed together, and many international lenders pulled back from financing new vessels. Greek owners, drawing more heavily on retained earnings and family capital than on external financing, were widely reported to have used the downturn to add tonnage at a fraction of pre-crisis prices. Layer 2. The charter. Almost none of these owners operate as traders themselves. Instead, they lease or charter their vessels to the companies that actually need to move cargo. Oil majors, state energy companies, grain trading houses, mining conglomerates, container liners. This can happen on the spot market, a single voyage negotiated through shipbrokers, frequently via the Baltic Exchange in London, the centuries-old marketplace where freight rates for dry bulk and tanker trades are assessed and published every trading day. Or it can happen through longer time charters, where a vessel is leased out for months or years at a fixed daily rate. Either way, the Greek owner functions less like a shipping company in the popular imagination and more like a landlord of the sea. They own the real estate, in this case a moving steel hull the length of 3 football fields, and rent it to whoever needs to cross the ocean that particular month. Layer 3. The paperwork. Every one of these vessels must be inspected and certified seaworthy by a classification society. Organizations such as Lloyd's Register, DNV, or the American Bureau of Shipping, and insured against liability, pollution, and injury claims through protection and indemnity clubs. Mutual insurers historically anchored in London and Scandinavia that collectively, through the international group of P&I clubs, cover roughly 90% of the world's ocean-going tonnage. Layer this together, and a single voyage of a single tanker typically involves a Greek beneficial owner, a Panamanian or Marshall Islands flag, a British or Norwegian classification society, a London-based mutual insurer, and a charterer that could be headquartered almost anywhere on Earth. 2 distinct kinds of insurance sit underneath every voyage: hull and machinery cover, which protects the physical value of the ship itself and is typically placed with commercial insurers, and protection and indemnity cover, which protects against the far larger financial exposure of an oil spill, a collision, or a crew injury claim, and is placed instead with the mutual, member-owned P&I clubs. Because P&I cover for a single major spill can run into the billions of dollars, and because the international group of clubs effectively sets the practical ceiling on what a vessel can legally and safely trade without coverage, this insurance layer has historically functioned as one of the few genuine points of leverage the West retained over global shipping, which is exactly the lever regulators tried to pull when constructing the Russian oil price cap, and exactly the lever that a growing, less transparent, shadow insurance market, often based outside traditional Western jurisdictions, has increasingly worked to root around. No single government sits at the center of a normal voyage, coordinating or approving it. That is not an accident of history. It is the entire design of the modern shipping industry, built up over more than a century, specifically to distribute risk and reduce any single point of control. Layer 4. The crew. Walk onto a Greek-owned tanker and you will typically find very few Greek nationals aboard. The officers and ratings are overwhelmingly drawn from the Philippines, India, Ukraine, and a handful of other maritime labor markets that supply the global shipping industry with trained seafarers at internationally competitive wages, coordinated through specialized crewing and manning agencies. Even the human presence on board tells an outside observer almost nothing about who actually owns the vessel or profits from its voyage. Stack all four of these layers together: the asset, the charter, the paperwork, and the crew, and you get a system that is, by design, almost impossible to see clearly from the outside, let alone regulate or coerce as a single entity. There is a fifth, quieter layer sitting above all of them: regulatory influence at the International Maritime Organization, the United Nations body that sets the rules governing safety, pollution, and emissions for the entire global fleet. Because Greek shipowners control such a large share of the tonnage any new IMO rule would actually apply to, their industry association, the Union of Greek Shipowners, has functioned for years as one of the most consistently influential private voices inside IMO proceedings, shaping how ambitious global decarbonization targets are phased in and how quickly older vessels are required to retire or retrofit. Power over the rules in this industry tends to sit with whoever owns the ships those rules will be written for. That invisibility became a matter of enormous, very public geopolitical consequence starting in 2022. When Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine triggered a wave of coordinated Western sanctions, the G7 nations, the European Union, and Australia moved to cap the price of Russian seaborne crude oil at $60 a barrel, effective from December of that year. The mechanism relied on a specific and, on paper, elegant lever. Because Western shipping, insurance, and financial services still dominate global maritime trade, they would simply refuse to handle any cargo of Russian oil sold above that price. In theory, this would force Russia to either sell its crude at a steep discount to maintain access to Western-linked tankers and insurance, or struggle to move meaningful volumes of oil at all. In practice, this policy ran directly into the structure described above. Because such a large share of the world's tanker capacity is owned by private Greek shipping families, who answer to no government and operate as independent commercial actors, the price cap depended almost entirely on voluntary compliance by companies that had every financial incentive not to comply. Reporting by the Financial Times, drawing on freight pricing data from the pricing agency Argus Media and vessel tracking data from the analytics firm Kepler, found that Greek shipping companies earned at least $3.8 billion transporting Russian crude oil across the roughly 2 years following mid-2023, with Greek-owned tankers estimated to account for around a fifth of the fleet moving Russian oil to buyers in Asia, a fleet that analysts and Western officials now commonly refer to as Russia's shadow fleet. Separate maritime intelligence analysis found that in some individual months, Greek-owned vessels were reportedly lifting close to 15 to 20% of all Russian seaborne crude oil exports on their own. A handful of firms accounted for a disproportionate share of these earnings. Dynacom Tankers, controlled by Greek shipping magnate George Prokopiou, was estimated by the Financial Times to have generated more than $900 million in freight revenue from Russian crude since mid-2023, nearly a quarter of all revenue earned by Greek shipowners from that specific trade. The Onassis Group's Olympic Shipping and Management followed with more than $400 million. Athens-based operators Stealth Maritime and Polembros Shipping each reportedly surpassed $200 million. Analysts pointed to a straightforward commercial logic behind these numbers. Charterers were reportedly willing to pay freight rates 30 to 40% above normal market levels to secure vessels willing to move Russian crude under sanctions risk. And in an industry fragmented across thousands of independent, privately held owners, someone was always going to accept that premium if it was high enough. It's worth noting that transporting Russian oil was not, by itself, illegal under Western sanctions. What mattered was compliance with the price cap, and enforcement of that specific mechanism proved extraordinarily difficult to police across a fleet this decentralized. The industry's own defenders have pushed back on the framing of this trade as sanctions busting in any strict legal sense. Greek shipowners' representatives have pointed out that carrying Russian oil was never itself prohibited under the G7 framework, only carrying it above the price cap while using Western insurance and services was, and that so-called attestation documents, in which sellers certified a cargo's price to insurers, were widely used across the industry, not invented by Greek operators specifically. Critics, including several Western officials and energy analysts, counter that widespread use of mispriced or incomplete attestations effectively meant the cap functioned as a legal fiction for much of its first 2 years, since investigators found essentially no verified cargo actually sold at or below the $60 threshold during that period. Both things can be true at once. The trade was largely legal on paper, and it also substantially undercut the policy's intended economic effect. That gap between legal compliance and policy effectiveness is, in miniature, the entire story of trying to govern a fleet this decentralized. Enforcement, in practice, has come down to a technological cat-and-mouse game, playing out largely in silence. Every large commercial vessel is required to broadcast its position through the Automatic Identification System, or AIS, a transponder signal that lets port authorities, insurers, and analytics firms like Kepler and Windward track global shipping in something close to real time. Analysts monitoring the so-called shadow fleet have documented vessels going deliberately dark, switching off their transponders for days at a stretch while transiting sensitive waters, and conducting ship-to-ship transfers far out at sea, where crude oil is pumped from one tanker to another, deliberately blurring the paper trail of where a cargo actually originated before it reaches its final buyer. None of this requires a government's involvement. It requires only a captain, a charterer, and a commercial incentive large enough to justify the operational risk. Western regulators have tried to respond directly at the vessel level. The US Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control has added individual tankers, one hull at a time, to its sanctions list for violating the price cap, and the European Union has done the same under its own sanctions packages. But sanctioning individual ships turned out to be a slow, almost artisanal process against a fleet numbering in the thousands, and UNCTAD's own tracking found that the average time between a vessel being sanctioned and reappearing under a new name and a new registry fell by roughly half in 2025 alone, a direct measure of how quickly this decentralized system can absorb and route around targeted pressure. This is the fragility hiding underneath the geography, and it is the pivot point of this entire briefing. A cornerstone of Western sanctions policy, a policy designed and announced by the world's most powerful governments, meant to constrain one of the largest economies on Earth, depended for its actual effectiveness on the voluntary restraint of private ship owners clustered on a single street in a mid-sized Mediterranean country. None of those ship owners had signed any treaty. None of them could be directly compelled by Washington or Brussels. Many of them, facing a straightforward and legal commercial opportunity, had every financial reason to take it. By late 2025, as the European Union tightened its price cap mechanism to a floating rate set roughly 15% below prevailing market prices for Russian crude, Tracking data suggested fewer Greek-owned vessels were willing to continue taking on that specific trade. Evidence that sustained multilateral pressure could eventually shift behavior, but also a striking reminder of how long that pressure took to work and how much real leverage sat the entire time, not inside any foreign ministry, but inside private ledgers on Acti Miauli. That is the mechanism in full. A privately owned, globally dispersed, flag-diversified fleet that no single government directly controls, moving somewhere between a sixth and a fifth of everything the world ships by sea, capable of bending, or quietly resisting, the sanctions architecture of the world's most powerful economic blocs, simply by continuing to do what it has always done: chase the highest available freight rate, wherever in the world that rate happens to be. It is easy to describe all of this as an abstraction. It is much harder to grasp what it actually means in dollars, jobs, and strategic leverage. But the real story isn't what happens on the map. It's what happens to the money. Start with what shipping means to Greece itself, because the scale is easy to underestimate from the outside. According to the Union of Greek Shipowners, maritime transport contributes somewhere between 7 and 8% of Greek GDP, once direct and indirect effects are counted, and it supports on the order of 200,000 jobs in a country of roughly 10 million people, a workforce comparable in size to an entire mid-sized Greek city. In 2022 alone, inflows to the Greek balance of payments from sea transport surpassed 21 billion euros, the single largest contribution of any sector to the country's external accounts that year. Tourism gets the postcards, the headlines, and the seasonal news coverage. Shipping, almost silently, pays a much larger and far more strategically important share of the bills. Part of what keeps Greek shipping at the front of the pack is the sheer scale of ongoing reinvestment. Industry figures put the number of new vessels on order for Greek owners in the 2025 to 2026 period at more than 700, representing tens of millions of deadweight tons and a combined price tag in the tens of billions of dollars. A wave of new building heavily weighted toward cleaner, more fuel-efficient tankers and LNG carriers, positioning Greek owners to remain dominant even as the industry slowly shifts toward lower carbon fuels and stricter emissions rules. This is not incidental spending. It is a deliberate bet, repeated by generation after generation of the same families, that whoever owns the newest, most compliant tonnage when the rules tighten will capture the largest share of the market that remains. The wealth this generates rarely stays confined to shipping alone. Greece's largest ship-owning families have, over decades, diversified substantial portions of their fortunes into real estate, hospitality, banking, and increasingly, renewable energy and digital infrastructure, both inside Greece and internationally, meaning the influence of this single industry radiates outward into large parts of the broader Greek and, to some extent, European economy, well beyond anything that shows up directly in shipping statistics. Zoom out to the European Union as a whole, and the strategic weight becomes even clearer. Greek-controlled tonnage accounts for roughly 60% of the entire EU-controlled merchant fleet, a staggering concentration for a country that represents a small fraction of the bloc's total population and economic output. That means when Europe scrambled to replace Russian pipeline gas with seaborne liquefied natural gas after 2022, building new import terminals in Germany, the Netherlands, and elsewhere at record speed, a disproportionate share of the specialized tankers physically capable of delivering that gas were, and remain, owned by Greek shipping families. European energy security, in a very literal and physical sense, runs through Piraeus, at least as much as it runs through Brussels. There is a second, quieter economy sitting on top of this one: the flag registries themselves. Liberia, Panama, and the Marshall Islands host the world's three largest ship registers, together accounting for roughly half of the planet's ocean-going tonnage. Yet none of these countries owns any meaningful share of the ships flying their flags. The Marshall Islands Registry, for instance, is run under contract by a private American company. And while the exact sums the government collects are not publicly disclosed, registry and tonnage fees provide a real, if modest by national budget standards, stream of outside revenue for a nation of just over 40,000 people whose government budget still depends primarily on direct US aid. It is a small but telling illustration of how thoroughly this industry has been engineered to separate ownership, flag, capital, and physical control into different jurisdictions, each with its own narrow financial stake in keeping the arrangement exactly as it is. Now look at who else benefits from this arrangement beyond Greece's ship-owning families. The London shipbroking, legal, and marine insurance industry that services this fleet, the Baltic Exchange, the international group of P&I clubs, the maritime law firms clustered around the City of London, has built an entire specialized ecosystem around managing risk for vessels that are largely foreign-flagged and internationally crewed, yet Greek-owned. Shipbuilders in South Korea, Japan, and increasingly China collect billions of dollars in new-build orders precisely because Greek owners are, historically, among the most reliable long-cycle customers in the industry. Global data shows roughly 90% of all large commercial ships completed in a given year are built in just three countries: China, South Korea, and Japan. Meaning even the physical construction of Greek-owned tonnage sits almost entirely outside Greece itself. The value chain of a single Greek-owned tanker typically spans a Korean or Japanese shipyard for construction, Greek capital and decision-making, a Central American or Pacific Island flag registry for legal domicile, British or Scandinavian insurance and classification for risk coverage, Filipino or Indian crew for operation, and a charter to an oil major or trading house that could be headquartered almost anywhere on the planet. No single nation captures more than a slice of that chain, which is precisely why no single nation can easily challenge, replicate, or seize it as a whole. It's worth pausing on the one serious long-term challenger to this arrangement, because it is not a small one. China's own beneficially owned fleet, when combined with vessels owned through Hong Kong, has grown to rival, and by some counts, surpass Greece's share of global tonnage, backed by state shipbuilding policy, state financing through institutions like the China Development Bank, and the deliberate strategic goal of reducing reliance on foreign-owned, foreign-insured shipping for cargo Beijing considers strategically sensitive. Unlike the Greek model, which is built on thousands of independent private family firms competing and sometimes undercutting one another, China's growing fleet is increasingly anchored around a small number of large, state-linked companies, such as COSCO, giving Beijing a degree of centralized command over its own tonnage that Greece's fragmented ownership structure was never designed to offer any government, including its own. But one country has decided that owning the ships circulating through this system is not enough. It also wants to own the ground those ships touch when they dock. In 2016, China's state-owned shipping conglomerate COSCO acquired a 51% stake in the Piraeus Port Authority, the company that runs Greece's largest port, for roughly €280 million, as part of a broader wave of privatizations tied to Greece's international bailout agreements. By 2021, under the escrow terms of that original deal, COSCO's stake had risen to 67%, making the Chinese state the controlling shareholder of the physical port infrastructure, sitting at the very center of global Greek shipping. Piraeus has since grown into one of the busiest container ports in the Mediterranean and a critical node in China's Belt and Road ambitions into southern and central Europe, with a concession to operate the port running until 2052. The result is a genuinely striking split, almost a live experiment playing out on a single stretch of docks. The ships themselves, the mobile, high-value, endlessly reflaggable assets that actually move the world's oil, gas and grain, remain overwhelmingly in private Greek hands, distributed across thousands of independent companies. The fixed infrastructure those ships increasingly dock at, in their own home port, is majority owned by the Chinese state, concentrated in a single company answerable to Beijing. It represents two entirely different theories of maritime power, unfolding side by side. One built on owning distributed, mobile assets that are almost impossible to seize or coerce as a whole, and another built on owning fixed, visible, defensible infrastructure that can be directly controlled and leveraged. Neither model has fully displaced the other. Both continue to expand simultaneously in the same port city. Freight markets themselves have repeatedly demonstrated just how much leverage sits inside this system and how unevenly the financial consequences of global instability land. When Houthi forces based in Yemen began attacking commercial shipping transiting the southern Red Sea in late 2023, a large share of container and tanker traffic that normally passed through the Suez Canal rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope in southern Africa instead, adding roughly 1 to 2 weeks to voyage times between Asia and Europe, and sharply tightening the effective global supply of available shipping capacity almost overnight. Freight rates spiked sharply. Container shipping rates on major global routes rose by roughly 130% between the start of November 2023 and the start of March 2024, according to research compiled by the OECD's International Transport Forum. While World Bank analysis found that container traffic through the Suez Canal itself collapsed by roughly 90% in those same first few months, before settling into a period of prolonged, sharply suppressed volumes that persisted through 2025. Tanker traffic through the same waters fell by a smaller but still significant margin, as some operators judged the risk acceptable and others did not. That judgment call was not abstract. In August 2024, the Sounion, a Greek-flagged tanker carrying roughly 150,000 tons of Iraqi crude oil, was struck and set ablaze by Houthi missiles while transiting the Red Sea, a stark illustration that the vessels generating this windfall revenue were not shielded from the same violence driving the freight rate spike in the first place. Because Greek owners control such an outsized share of tanker tonnage in particular, this single regional disruption translated directly into significant windfall revenue for a relatively small number of private companies concentrated in Piraeus, alongside real, and sometimes fatal, operational risk for the crews aboard their vessels. The same basic pattern has repeated, in different forms, around the Strait of Hormuz during periods of heightened tension between Iran and Western powers, and around the Black Sea grain corridor during the most intense phases of the war in Ukraine. Each time a choke point anywhere in the world comes under stress, a meaningful share of the resulting financial upside flows to the same cluster of family-run offices on the same Athens waterfront, almost regardless of which specific choke point is involved. Step back and compare this to how economic power was distributed for most of the 20th century, and the shift becomes even sharper. During the Cold War, control over global trade routes was still largely a story about naval bases, colonial-era port concessions, and formal alliances. The United States and the Soviet Union each built networks of client states and military footholds specifically to secure access to the sea lanes their economies depended on. What Greek shipping represents is a quieter, more privatized successor to that model. Instead of a state building bases to guarantee access to shipping lanes, a cluster of private families simply came to own such a large share of the ships themselves that access became almost beside the point. You do not need a naval base in the Strait of Malacca if you own 1/5 of the tankers passing through it. You do not need a colonial concession in a foreign port if your charter can simply instruct the vessel to sail somewhere else entirely. This is, in a very real sense, a cheaper and more resilient form of the same strategic goal every major power has pursued since the age of sail: secure, reliable access to the sea lanes that carry a nation's trade, achieved not through territory or military presence, but through simple, patient, generational ownership of the moving parts. Put the pieces together, and a clear picture emerges. Greece's shipping fleet is not simply a national industry that happens to be unusually large. It functions as a load-bearing structure inside the global economy, financing European energy security, absorbing and redistributing the financial shockwaves of wars and blockades thousands of kilometers from Greek shores, and quietly complicating the sanctions strategy of the world's most powerful governments, all while remaining almost entirely outside the direct operational control of any single state, including, in important respects, Greece's own government, which regulates the industry but does not command it. Which leaves us with one final question, the one that changes how you'll read the news from now on. So here is the question we opened with. How does a country with roughly 10 million people and no meaningful navy hold this much leverage over the global economy? And what would actually happen if it decided, collectively, to use it? The answer is that Greece's power was never really about controlling a place. It's about controlling an asset that refuses to stay in one place. A strait can be blockaded. A canal can be closed by a single grounded ship, as the world saw when a container vessel wedged itself across the Suez Canal in 2021. A pipeline can be sabotaged or shut off at a valve, as Europe learned the hard way after 2022. All of those are fixed points on a map, which is exactly why they dominate most conversations about global strategic choke points, and exactly why they are, comparatively, the easiest forms of leverage to defend against, sanction, monitor, or ultimately seize. A fleet of nearly 6,000 individually owned vessels scattered across every ocean on Earth at any given moment, flagged to a dozen different jurisdictions, chartered to companies on every inhabited continent, is not a fixed point at all. It behaves less like a piece of infrastructure and more like a weather system. You cannot picket it. You cannot easily sanction an ownership structure spread across hundreds of independent family companies with no shared chain of command. You cannot blockade a commercial decision made quietly in one office on Acti Miauli, because an equivalent decision is being made, independently and differently, in dozens of other offices on that same street at that same hour. That is precisely why Western governments spent years struggling to enforce something as conceptually simple as a price cap on Russian oil. Not because the policy itself was poorly designed on paper, but because it was aimed at a target that does not behave like a government, a single company, or even a unified industry. It behaves like thousands of independent commercial actors, each running its own calculation, each capable of shifting course overnight, none of them bound to act in concert with the others. And it is precisely why, if Greek shipowners collectively decided tomorrow to pull back from a particular category of cargo or slow their pace of new vessel orders, global freight rates and energy flows would feel the effect within a matter of weeks, while there would be no single company to sanction, no capital city to pressure, no navy to negotiate with. Just thousands of separate private decisions adding up to something that looks, from a distance, remarkably like a single, coordinated global force, without ever actually being one. That is the real lesson underneath this story, and it extends well beyond shipping itself. In the 21st century, some of the most durable forms of geopolitical power no longer live on the traditional map at all. Not in borders, not in navies, and not even in the physical choke points that dominate most conversations about global strategy. Increasingly, they live in capital, in generational expertise passed down inside family firms, and in ownership structures deliberately built over decades to sit just outside the reach of any single government. Ports can be bought, as China demonstrated at Piraeus. Straits can be patrolled, pipelines can be shut. But an asset that moves constantly, that can be reflagged overnight, that answers to private ledgers instead of national ones, is extraordinarily difficult to seize, coerce, or even fully observe from the outside. The next major shifts in global economic power may not come from someone planting a flag on new territory at all. They may come from someone quietly buying the fleet that everyone else already depends on, and saying almost nothing about it, for as long as possible. None of this makes Greece a villain in the story, and it would be a mistake to read it that way. Nothing described in this briefing is illegal. Every layer of it, the flags of convenience, the charter markets, the family ownership structures, even the legal ambiguity around the Russian price cap, grew up openly, over decades, inside a system that Western governments themselves built, and for most of that time, actively benefited from. The lesson is not that someone is cheating. It's that the architecture of modern global trade was built for efficiency and flexibility first, and control a distant second. And that whoever understands that trade-off earliest and positions themselves inside it patiently enough ends up holding leverage that no warship could ever have delivered as quietly or as cheaply. This pattern is not unique to shipping, once you know to look for it. The undersea fiber optic cables carrying the overwhelming majority of the world's internet traffic are owned by a small, shifting coalition of telecom firms and tech companies, largely invisible until one is damaged and a region briefly notices its connection to the rest of the world was never as solid as it felt. The messaging network that lets banks move money across borders operates as a private cooperative headquartered in Belgium, largely unknown outside financial circles, until it becomes, briefly, a geopolitical weapon in a sanctions dispute. Greek shipping belongs to this same family of quiet infrastructure. Systems so deeply embedded in how the modern world functions that they only become visible, briefly, at the exact moment something goes wrong with them. The rest of the time, they simply work, unnoticed, which is precisely the point, and precisely why so few people outside the industry can name the country that owns a fifth of the ships carrying their own energy and food supply across the ocean. If this kind of analysis, the hidden systems running underneath the headlines, is what you come here for, subscribe to Meridian Theory and turn on notifications, because that's exactly what this channel exists to map. Every time where power, geography, and money collide.